Hello and welcome to the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty's webinar on 10 cities, homelessness, and human rights in 2014. My name is Eric Tars. I'm the director of our Human Rights and Children's Rights programs, and I'm happy to be with you today. We're also happy to have with us Amy Sawyer from the US Interagency Council on Homelessness, who will be talking a little bit later about some of the work that the Interagency Council is doing in this context. Today we'll give just a little flavor of a lot of the work that we have going on. And we'll start off by talking about the upcoming reviews of the U.S. government by international human rights monitors and how we're using them to change our domestic policy dialogue around homelessness. We'll discuss some of the findings from our new report on 10 cities, as well as our Human Right to Housing report card, which came out in December. And we'll talk about what those of you on the webinar can do to help bring human rights home to your communities. Because of the large number of people on this webinar, we're muting people's microphones. But if folks have questions throughout the presentation, just type them into the chat box on your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. But before we go too far, let's do a quick poll and see what people's baseline is. First, do you believe that housing is a human right? Excellent. With about 3/4 of you having voted, it looks like the overwhelming say yes, around 85%, and then a few say maybe, and a couple say no or not sure. So that's great news. It's a good baseline to begin with in our presentation. Next, have you talked about homelessness as a human rights issue before? Fantastic. With most of you having voted, it looks like the say yes frequently or occasionally, and with a couple saying not yet. But we'll hope to change that by the end of the webinar, and we'll hope you'll all be at that point ready and excited to start talking about housing and human rights. So the good news is that there will be many opportunities to practice beyond what you're doing already. The next 12 months will see the U.S. reviewed under every major human rights treaty that is ratified. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights review will take place in March, just next week. The International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination will have its review in August. The Committee Against Torture will review the U.S. in November. And then the Human Rights Council will review the U.S. under the Universal Periodic Review mechanism in March 2015. You might ask why we at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, a domestic advocacy organization, want to use these international processes to talk about our issues. 3 reasons. First, to shine a light on issues that don't get attention here in the U.S. Second, to make the promise of human rights treaties specific to our campaigns. And third, to keep the record straight about what our country is and isn't doing to guarantee these rights. Each of these treaty reviews has both formal and informal parts operating in parallel, with the formal dialogue being between the government and the treaty monitoring body, and the informal process where we as advocates plug in. The government kicks off the process by issuing its report, as it has already done for the 3 treaty reviews. For some of these treaties, the government makes specific references to homelessness issues, and for the review under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Law Center has already done its part in the informal process by issuing the full analysis or shadow report of the issues of homelessness covered by the treaty. For other treaties, we're still working on our analysis, and we'd welcome collaboration by other interested parties, so feel free to get in touch with me if you're interested. As a result of our advocacy, the Human Rights Committee asked our government a specific question about the criminalization of homelessness, and the U.S. replied in writing to the committee's questions. We used this question to prompt a conversation last July hosted by the US Interagency Council on Homelessness with specific recommendations on how they and their partner agencies could address criminalization of homelessness in keeping with their treaty obligations. I'll now let Amy Sawyer with the Interagency Council tell you a little bit more about how the US Interagency Council and its member agencies have been engaged in this process and have been working to implement the human rights of homeless persons both in their federal work and all the way down to the local level. Just a moment here while I put Amy on. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble finding Amy on our attendee list. Amy, are you there? Here's Amy trying to talk, but I can't find her. Can you, Amy, can you try raising your hand as an attendee? Oh, there you are. All right.
Hi, this is Amy. Are you able to hear me now?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for bearing with us. Happy to be here today, and I thought I'd start out by just describing that the U.S. Interagency Council role is to engage in partnerships at all levels of government with communities across the country to implement Opening Doors, which is the federal plan to end homelessness. And within Opening Doors, there is a piece of it that addresses criminalization of homelessness. It includes a strategy to define constructive approaches to addressing street homelessness, and it considers incentives to urge cities to adopt these practices. And as you heard Eric describe, we worked together with the Department of Justice and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as national and local organizations to develop Searching Out Solutions. And in this document, we talked with communities about what we've learned about ways to leverage housing and resources to connect people to stable housing instead of focusing on criminalization. And this is available on our website, and you can see it on our landing page, which I've made a reference to on the slide. It's a human rights landing page. There's a lot of other information there as well that you may appreciate seeing. So in July 2013, in partnership with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and as you heard, spurred on in part by the State Department's need to know more about human rights and homelessness, US ICH convened a conversation with our member agencies, and we asked, what are we doing currently to support alternatives to criminalization, and where are there opportunities to take additional action? Subsequent to that conversation, we reported what we learned to the State Department, which will use this information as a part of the oral defense in Geneva this month, as they discuss U.S. activity around the International Covenant on Human Rights. And we plan to continue to work with the state to support their work on human rights, as well as engage in active dialogue with agencies and national organizations, clarifying how we can support efforts to address this important issue. And I want to give you a few examples of what came out of these conversations. First, there's an increased focus on this issue with our federal agency partners. They're talking about it, they're asking for information, they're sharing information, and they're reaching out to national partners like the National Law Center to broaden the discussion. And we're also seeing commitment to using various forms of media to communicate about existing programs and projects within agencies, as well as through joint interagency efforts so that communities have access to tools that they need or want. An example of this would be the Mythbuster document prepared by the Interagency Reentry Council, which clarifies existing federal policies that affect formerly incarcerated individuals and their families. This is a really, really great tool, and it can be promoted to communities through current federal agency communications channels. And the last example I thought I would share is very specific to one of our federal partners, which is HUD. And they're looking at how to include and evaluate responses to a question about alternatives to criminalization in their grants to states and communities. Beyond these discussions, to further elevate the issue, we hosted a human rights series in December and January that included blogs from agency partners, as well as newsletter articles discussing human rights in relation to homelessness. And this blog series was one of the most well-read of all year, of the full year. And if you'd like to see some of those blogs, you can find them at the landing page that's referenced on the slide. We're currently working on a second series on alternatives to criminalization to be published in the first half of April. This series will include things like a blog, newsletter, peer-to-peer calls to support communities who are working with encampments, and a report out on what we've learned about encampments. And to that end, if anyone on the call has experience or thoughts about encampments, we welcome that input as we pull together voices and experiences for this report. And we look forward to sharing what we learn as we delve into the impact of criminalization and creative solutions communities across the country are putting into play. So in summary, through convening conversations, building partnerships with people and organizations across the country and within federal agencies, and asking people to tell their stories, building on what works, we at USICH are hoping to continue to foster a dialogue that connects the work to ending homelessness with the very important issue of human rights. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amy. Sorry again about the technical difficulties, but it's really great to see the responsiveness that the Interagency Council has had and the affirmative way that they have started talking about homelessness and especially criminalization of homelessness as a human rights issue. And we'll be building on this next week as we go to Geneva, where the U.S. will be reviewed in 2 3-hour sessions by the Human Rights Committee. And similar processes to this will take place for the other treaties, as I said, in August and November later this year and in March of next year. And while we're there, we'll have the opportunity to meet with the committee both in formal and informal briefings to talk with the committee about our issues of criminalization of homelessness and other homelessness-related issues. And our policy director, Jeremy Rosen, who will be in attendance, will be blogging and tweeting live from the event. And you can follow along on our blog at homelessnesslaw.org or on Twitter at @NLCHP-Homeless. So what are we hoping to get out of this process? We're hoping that the review will result in 2 specific observations for the U.S. First, that the committee will commend the positive steps taken so far by the U.S. with regards to the criminalization of homelessness, and then that the committee will note their concern under a broad range of articles about criminalization, including Article 7 of the treaty, which relates to cruel and human degrading treatment. We suggest that the committee call for criminalization practices to be immediately ceased with strong language that is applicable to any context in the local levels where it's happening. And then we specify actions that we believe the federal government should take in order to be in compliance with the treaty. Our shadow report also goes into significantly more depth on individual recommendations for the Department of Justice, HUD, and other agencies which fall under these general guidelines. So through our conversations, such as the one that we've had with the Interagency Council last July, these agencies know exactly what they're being held accountable to in this process. So just to review, these are the upcoming opportunities for getting involved, and if you're interested in doing so, please feel free to get in contact with us, and we'll loop you in as the discussions on each of these treaties ramps up. Now I'll talk a little bit about our 10 cities report, giving just a very small flavor of each of the major sections of the report. Due to production issues, the report won't be available until Monday, but you'll all receive an automatic email with a link when it's available, just for having registered for this webinar. For any members of the media, we are happy to share an advanced text copy with you today. If you're interested in that, please get in touch with me at the email address on the screen. The report opens with some background on 10 cities. We conducted a media survey from 2008 to 2013 and found over 100 encampments reported in 46 of 51 states. We know of several others that didn't make it into online accessible news sources, so we know that even this figure is an underestimate. Of these, only 8 encampments had some form of regularized legal status, and most were evicted and no longer exist, although new ones often pop up in their places as the old ones are shut down. The conditions in these camps ran the gamut, with many displaying exceptional forms of self-governance, but some presenting dangerous situations for the people living there. The students from the Yale Law Clinic with whom we collaborated on this report visited 4 sites to examine their responses to 10 cities. In Providence, Rhode Island, they found evidence of a well-organized community that was ultimately disbanded by the city through a combination of positive alternatives and some coercion. But their struggles led Rhode Island to pass the first ever statewide homeless bill of rights. In Lakewood, New Jersey, a long-standing tent city that had been tacitly encouraged by local government was threatened with eviction. But thanks to great legal advocacy by Jeff Wild and the New Jersey Coalition to End Homelessness, with some international human rights language in their briefs to the courts that was contributed by the Law Center and the Yale students, the eviction was stopped, and now 30 of the approximately 100 residents have been settled into hotels with 1-year vouchers under a settlement with the city. There are some remaining details to work out on the settlement, but this is a fantastic example of a positive way to address tent cities by providing housing rather than simply evicting people with nowhere else to go. On a similar note, New Orleans experienced a huge growth in homelessness following Hurricane Katrina, resulting in 3 tent cities over the course of a few years there. While initially moving towards evicting the campers, the city reversed course and then partnered with a local homeless service organization, Unity of Greater New Orleans, and together with state and federal officials, they were able to draw on post-Katrina resources to close the camps by providing permanent supportive housing for almost every person there. While these resources don't exist in every situation, this approach again represents a very positive model. Last, in St. Petersburg, Florida, a number of informal encampments have been violently evicted from downtown areas, including one where the police came and slashed the tents of the homeless residents with box cutters so that they couldn't resettle elsewhere. While many of the criminalization ordinances remain, the city has also explored an alternative approach with two forms of institutionalized encampments. The first, Pinellas Hope, is an institutionalized tent city and dry shelter run by Catholic Charities. It has a capacity of about 250 tents with permanent housing units constructed on the periphery. The second, Safe Harbor, is a wet shelter, meaning individuals do not have to be sober in order to enter. It includes an outdoor camping space and indoor dorm-like lodgings, but is located in a converted minimum security jail annex and serves as both a shelter and a jail diversion program for homeless persons. It's been criticized for its jail-like conditions by the local advocates and is being used by the police to compel homeless persons to take this accommodation or suffer arrest under some of the other criminalizing ordinances. So while providing some housing alternatives, the coercion involved in the overall approach remains a concern. Much more details about each of these sites is available in our report. Beyond the case studies, the report also covers the full range of domestic and international law applicable to 10 cities. Homeless individuals have often brought overlapping claims under the 4th, 5th, 8th, and 14th Amendments on theories that the government has unlawfully seized or destroyed their personal property or infringed on their rights of due process, to bodily integrity, and to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. While the courts have upheld these claims in the context of government-style sweeps, they have been less willing to apply the rights affirmatively to stop demolitions by the state or local government when those governments have given some minimum form of due process and property is protected. Religious hosts of encampments, however, have been successful in both circumstances under a First Amendment theory that adverse government action infringed on their right to free exercise of religion. Additionally, the Fair Housing Act may be a legal theory to pursue, although this has not yet been tested, and the outcome would depend on a variety of factors, which we discussed further in the report. State law has also provided partial protection for homeless encampments. For homeless encampments on public lands, where the government has tacitly consented to the encampment, promissory estoppel arguments have been successful, at least in early stages of litigation. For example, in Lakewood, New Jersey, the tent city's residents argued that police and other government officials had condoned their encampment by affirmatively sending people there and taking steps to make the camp more livable for them. The doctrine of unclean hands prevents the court from granting an injunction to a litigant who's already guilty of wrongdoing directly connected with the lawsuit. And when they were sued for eviction, both Tent City in Lakewood and Camp Runamuck in Providence, Rhode Island, argued that the state had unclean hands based on the duty that the state owed to the homeless people under different state statutes, creating a duty to shelter the poor. In neither case did the court fully vindicate or fully discredit that argument, so future litigation is possible on these grounds, although finding the state duty to aid the poor will be different from state to state. Homeless litigants can also say that their trespass or act of camping is justified because any harm they cause is outweighed by the harm their trespass avoids, that being the imminent threat to their own lives, and that they also had no legal alternatives to avoid this harm. All of these theories have found mixed results in state courts and present potential dangers if not done well, so we encourage groups interested in using them to read our report carefully and be in touch with us if there's any questions. Federal and state courts are increasingly looking to international or regional law for guidance in their cases, regardless of whether the law is considered binding or not. As Amy noted earlier, the federal government has increasingly adopted a human rights approach to homelessness, which gives additional support for those wishing to use these standards as part of their claims. And a wealth of treaties and other human rights standards support the human right to housing, as well as the theory that punishing homeless individuals for living outdoors when they have no accessible legal alternative is cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, the international equivalent of our own 8th Amendment, or a violation of the right to life. Additionally, internationally, the rights to property and privacy may even apply in situations where the homeless residents don't have formal tenure over the places where they reside. I really encourage folks to read this section of the report because there's so much room for inspiration, whether in litigation or policy advocacy. And for further inspiration, the report offers examples of several countries which have taken a considerably more progressive approach to the right to housing and shelter than the U.S. The Indian Supreme Court has upheld the right to shelter under provisions of its constitution similar to the Due Process Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments and the right to travel. The South African Constitutional Court has found homeless persons could not be evicted from sheltered spaces unless alternative sheltered spaces were made available to them, even if they did not have a legal right to be in those spaces. The Colombian Constitutional Court, in addition to articulating a right to dignified housing, has granted relief to thousands of middle-class Colombian mortgage holders faced with the prospect of losing their homes because of the economic recession and a mortgage debtor crisis. And in Canada, the British Columbia Court of Appeal held that a city bylaw that prohibited homeless people from erecting temporary shelters in public parks when the shelter space was unavailable elsewhere constituted a violation of the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. While made in different legal and political contexts than the U.S., these judgments again provide inspiration for those working here. Again, this is just the briefest overview of a deeply researched report, so I encourage everyone to download and read the whole document when it's available on Monday. And as I said, you'll be receiving a link to the report as soon as it's up on our website. Finally, I wanted to share another recent resource from the Law Center, our annual Human Right to Housing Report Card, which assesses the current level of U.S. compliance with the human right to housing in the context of American homelessness against the internationally recognized standards of the human right to housing. The 2013 report card is itself an update of our 2011 report, Simply Unaccessible, which was the first ever measurement of these rights, of the right to housing against the internationally recognized standards. That original report was over 100 pages long, and this update is just 10 pages. But you can find further discussion of all the issues in the original document that's, again, here linked on our website. And as you can see, the grades haven't improved much over the past few years, although we do give credit this year, or for 2013, for the housing improvements coming out of the Domestic Violence, or the Violence Against Women Act, that created new protections, housing protections for domestic violence victims, and the positive steps on homelessness as a human rights issue taken by the Interagency Council. I'm not going to go into further details on this today, but there's some very excellent analysis in the report, and I encourage people to take a look at it. So finally, we'll go back to our polls before we wrap up. As a result of this webinar so far, do you feel that you have a better understanding of homelessness and human rights? All right, looking like about 90% saying yes, that's great. And are you likely to use what you've learned today in your work going forward? Fantastic, about 90% again saying either yes or maybe. So with that, let's talk about what you can do to make the human right to housing a reality here in our country. Because it is up to us to make sure that our government at the federal, state, and local levels are aware of and implementing the human rights of homeless people that I've been talking about today. Beyond just working on issues of homelessness, we at the National Law Center are leading the Human Rights at Home campaign's efforts to create models of institutionalized human rights accountability mechanisms throughout the federal government and down to the state and local level. And the examples that I've shared with you today of the strategies we've used are applicable not just to homelessness issues, but all across the board. And we're also very happy to share our expertise on that. and you can check out the website on the screen for more information on the campaign. Next, in terms of what we need to do to bring human rights home, first, we need to talk about housing as a human right. If we don't do it, who will? And although it might seem like a long shot now, we are making a difference. As I said before, HUD, the Department of Justice, and the Interagency Council have all adopted language from our reports talking about housing and homelessness as human rights issues, and that never would have happened if we hadn't been consistently and persistently including that framing in the first place. And at the local level, groups in cities from Los Angeles to New York, to Duluth to Madison are putting human rights language into local homeless bills of rights or resolutions on the human right to housing, and we are winning by reframing this issue. Next, you can educate yourself and other advocates and policymakers about the housing issues and human rights. You can check out all the reports I've mentioned today, as well as others that we have on our website on these issues. And finally, you can participate in the process of crafting new human rights standards. As I said, this coming year we'll see our country undergo 4 human rights reviews, which offers huge opportunities for people to get involved. And you can contact us to learn how to participate in these processes, use them to draw an international spotlight on your local issues, and create standards that will help in your work. So to wrap up, we talked today about the human rights reviews, including the review by the Human Rights Committee next week, which everyone should stay tuned to our Twitter and blog accounts for more information about that. We talked about our 10 cities report and our right to housing report card, and about ways that you can help bring the human right to housing home. So if there's any questions, again, you can type them into the question or chat boxes on your screen, and I'm happy to try and answer them. And you can also feel free to get in touch with me at any of the contact information on the screen now. And again, our 10 cities report should be available on Monday, but for any members of the media, we are happy to make an advanced text copy of the report available today if you're interested. So with that, got a question, it looks like. One person's asking, when will the guidelines for homeless bills of rights be available by the Law Center is working on some guidance on homeless bills of rights that should be coming out, we hope, by later this month. If not later this month, then early April. But that is very close to being done as well. Next question is, can you suggest how the Fair Housing Act might apply to the criminalization of homelessness? So again, this is covered in more depth in our report, but basically it's looking at it in the context of tent cities. There's some evidence to suggest that tent encampments may be considered dwellings under the Fair Housing Act, and that if you can connect that with a protected class, either under racial grounds, in many communities homelessness has a disparate racial impact, or disability, often homelessness has a disparate impact on people living with disabilities, that those could be theories under which you could address a government attempt to remove the opportunity to live in an encampment as under the Fair Housing Act. Again, we haven't found any evidence that these theories have been tried yet, but it's a possibility. Let's see here. There's a question about what is a state party to a treaty. The state party means, in this case, the U.S. It's the country that signs on to a treaty as it ratifies it. So it's just identifying that it has to be framed that way as in terms of how the committee will address the country. They address it as the state party, but it just means the U.S. government. There's a question about the number of the over 100 encampments we found. We found over 100 encampments total. And again, the methodology for conducting this survey was not extremely scientific. It was simply doing Google and other media resource surveys of available online newspaper articles that mention either tent city or encampment in connection with homelessness. And we excluded ones that were specific to the Occupy movement, which took place in that time when there were a lot of kind of encampments constructed in many downtown areas. We did sort of evaluate and re-include some where it appeared that there was a close connection between the homeless community and the Occupy movement as took place in a number of communities. But that was, so we found over 100 examples of tent encampments in the media, as I said, in 46 out of 51 jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia. And again, we know that this is a vast underestimate. We know there's dozens of encampments out there that haven't been covered in the media, and we know that many tent communities are very deliberately hidden from public view, so they're trying to avoid being found, and so they wouldn't be covered. So this number is a starting point, but definitely not the end point. There's a question about will copies of the PowerPoint be available? Yeah, we're happy to make that available. Again, we'll send out an email afterwards with links to the PowerPoint and the report, and also a recording of this webinar. If all is going technologically well, there will also be a recording of this webinar that we'll post on our YouTube site, and you'll get the link to that as well. There's a question about what will happen to the folks who were evicted from Tent City in Lakewood, New Jersey after the 1 year that they have their hotel vouchers for. At this point, we don't know. There's no further promise of assistance beyond that, but it's hoped that in the year that they have stable housing, that they will be able to have the stability they need to find permanent housing, either through government services or on their own. But that is obviously a concern. But this was kind of the best option in the settlement that the folks working on the case could work out. And obviously, that recognizes that there are people who are dealing with addiction or other mental health issues who won't necessarily be able to solve those in a year, but they can hopefully get in touch with resources, get it onto Social Security or other forms of income that will allow them to at least escape homelessness in that year period. Let's see here. There's somebody who's mentioning the St. Petersburg approach seems to be the model for initiatives now underway in Gainesville, Florida, and we've actually heard a number of reports of folks looking at the St. Petersburg model as a model, and the question says, in addition to the 10 cities report, are there other resources or contacts you'd recommend to advocates here? I think one of the best resources would be to be in contact with the Interagency Council on Homelessness, with Amy, and again, her contact information and the Interagency Council, and that's just usich.gov. And when the slides are available, the link to the government website is there. But they have resources in place to help communities discourage criminalization. And that's kind of one of the major pushes I would make. You know, I think there are some positive aspects of the St. Petersburg model, but the fact that it's being done in a very coercive way, saying we're creating this resource, but homeless people have no choice but to use it, or they will be arrested under these other ordinances, is very problematic. You know, it needs to be, the best way to approach it would be to make something that people would want to go to, would want to take advantage of, not be forced into with no alternative. So there, you know, I think depending on what elements are being taken by different cities from the St. Petersburg example, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, you know, the offering of legalized camping space in an organized way with resources, you know, it gives folks access to social workers and medical providers at Pinellas Hope. You know, those are very good models to follow, but you know, the criminalization aspects and some of the other restrictions are more worrisome. There's a question, I don't know if Amy, if you're still on the phone, but there's a question about, does the Interagency Council support the eviction of homeless people from tent cities when no housing alternatives are available?
This is Amy. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Certainly the content of Searching Out Solutions points to the fact that there needs to be a housing solution tied to any activity, any outreach, any type of communication with people who are experiencing homelessness. So we would endorse making sure that there is a solution, a housing solution, and in the best case scenario, multiple opportunities, so that when people are in an encampment, they have an option and they're not just being asked to move from one place to another. Is that helpful?
I think it's the, you know, the start of an answer, and you know, it's often you know, something that is part of a further discussion.
Okay, great.
There's another question about getting copies of the slides for the webinar. Again, we'll send that out. Since you registered for the webinar, you know, we have your email address on file, and as soon as it becomes available, either in the recorded form or just the presentation form, you'll get a notice about that with the link to them. Some folks are asking about how to get involved in the upcoming human rights reviews. My contact information is again available on the screen. You can send me an email and let me know that you'd like to participate in, if you're interested in doing it on a housing or homelessness issue. The US Human Rights Network is facilitating overall coordination for the involvement with the treaty reviews. That's ushrnetwork.org. And if you go on their website, you can find a wealth of information, get on their various listservs, so you'll be updated with information about getting involved. And that getting involved could mean anything from contributing to one of the shadow reports, either individual stories or you know, some analysis of a local human rights issue, or working in the community to educate people about the process. So, you know, these reviews are going to be happening in Geneva, but in all likelihood, they're not going to get a ton of mainstream media coverage in the U.S. So the more people who are aware of it locally and then using it as a tool, using it to hold their local government or our federal government accountable, the more powerful it's going to be. And there's a ton of different strategies of using video or whatever that could be potentially used in order to engage with the process. So it doesn't have to be you don't have to be a lawyer to engage, and it doesn't have to be all about writing a report. It can be in any form of organizing. There's an issue of, somebody said, many state constitutions can be interpreted more broadly than the federal constitution, which is a very good point. And we think there is a lot of room for working on affirmative human rights arguments, as well as affirmative arguments in the common law context and under the state constitutions directly in terms of advancing the right to housing, especially for people living in tent cities. And there's more information about that in the report that will be coming out on Monday. And if anybody has any specific questions, again, feel free to be in touch. Do we have any data or examples of how beneficial and effective city-permitted tent cities have been? I don't know that we have any specific data. There's a great amount of data out there talking about how housing in general is a more cost-effective solution than criminalization processes. Just that housing, somebody in a shelter for $25 a day is less expensive than putting that person in jail for $75 to $125 a day, and especially when adding in all the attendant court costs and police time and all of that. And then we know that the people who are living in these unstable situations incur significantly less healthcare costs. I think there may be some information about some of the more established tent cities. There's a number of more established tent cities on the West Coast, and I don't know if anybody's collecting data about those. We'd obviously be very interested to hear about that. But those kinds of questions aren't addressed in this report. There's a question about the banking sector's improper and illegal foreclosure practices, which led more people to lose access to housing, and any work in the private sector on advocacy or litigation on these issues. Those aren't covered in our 10 cities report. In general, we do believe that both there's private sector responsibility as well as a failure of governmental oversight in these regards that needs to be addressed. And all of those issues do have a disparate racial impact in this country for sure. And so those are probably issues that we'll be looking into a little bit more as we start preparing for our report to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination coming up later this year. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, we'd certainly be happy to have your participation. There's a question about homeless people being taken to FEMA camps. I haven't heard anything about that, but it's obviously it would be an issue of concern. So if there's anybody with information about that, we'd be interested to hear it. There's a suggestion about creating or formalizing a network of cities and states that are doing the right things or want to, but need the home of peers for the political support and being able to say that they're part of a movement of folks doing the right thing. I think that's a great suggestion. And if there are folks involved in city government or state government who would like to be part of that kind of a network, we'd certainly be interested in trying to foster that. I think the Interagency Council on Homelessness is going to be trying to foster that kind of peer-to-peer connection with some of the work that they're doing coming up. Amy, I don't know if you want to talk any more about that, or if there are any other examples of that kind of network that you guys already have in the works.
Sure, I can talk a little bit more about it. We've been working with communities and learning from the body of knowledge that's available about encampments and what strategies are most helpful, what strategies can communities employ to connect people to safe, stable housing, which is the end goal. And what we've learned is that it really takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of communication to be able to respond to the needs of people who are in an encampment. And so our goal is to bring together a conversation and facilitate a peer-to-peer conversation about what works, what doesn't, where are the touch points that people have found really effective, and where are some of the challenges that they could use assistance with. And, certainly we'll promote that through our communications channels, so you can keep an eye out for that. We're also working with the U.S. Conference of Mayors as a part of follow-up with our engagement with them to host a conversation with mayors and their key staff about the same issue. So providing a platform for community leaders at the mayoral level to look at this issue and to start to understand it.
Awesome, thank you, Amy. And I think one of the things that this report that we're issuing is trying to do is show some of these examples of the more positive steps that people have taken. But I think you're absolutely right. The more evidence of positive steps, positive approaches that exist out there, and a more active network of people fostering that is obviously a good way to go. We got a question about, do tent encampments and microhousing without heat or water meet the standards for housing from a human rights point of view? And that's a complicated question. On the face of it, no, not necessarily. We think that the existence of tent cities, that people live in these tent communities because they have no adequate alternative to go, represents a facial violation of the human right to housing. But we also believe that where this is their only alternative and governments aren't providing other adequate alternatives, and adequate meaning that's appropriate for the people who are using them. So perhaps in some communities there are shelter beds available, but that those beds would require people to split up their family, or aren't medically appropriate for the people who are trying to engage with them, either on a physical health level or a mental health level. Then that's not really adequate available alternatives. So where those adequate alternatives don't exist, then people shouldn't have the only shelter that they have taken away from them until that adequate alternative is provided. But that said, I think there's a number of steps that communities could do to make those the standards of habitability and legal security of tenure that are inherent in the human right to housing more available to the people living in tent communities, and what is adequate housing exists on a continuum. So a person who's living on their own in a tent with very little access to water and sanitary facilities, that's one situation. But a person who's part of a community where they have access to a porta potty, some fresh water line, some cooking facilities, other trash takeouts, that sort of thing, and has a legal right to be there, or at least knows they won't be harassed for being there, that's an improvement in their situation. And so as communities seek to make kind of a progressive realization of the human right to housing, taking things in the right direction rather than the wrong direction is obviously the way to go. And they can very much represent this as a step in the right direction. We in no way are advocating at tent cities as a permanent solution. We believe the permanent solution is adequate, affordable housing for all, and that's the true realization of the human right to housing. But until those resources are made available or the policies are changed to allow the markets to create that kind of housing, we believe that the people who are existing in these communities shouldn't be harassed for simply trying to exist. Someone is suggesting a regular webinar be established that individuals from various localities could discuss problems and successful solutions. I think the Interagency Council is definitely trying to create some sort of peer-to-peer sharing model, and again, we'd be interested in trying to help foster that as well. We have somebody from St. Petersburg advocating that the St. Petersburg model is not a good one, that they take the people to shelter run by the sheriff's office where they are criminalized, and that it's simply a attempt to hide the homelessness that exists in the community. And this viewpoint is definitely reflected in our report. We're very careful to take both the government side and the provider side and individual testimonies into account as we talk about each of the situations, each of the 4 case studies. And as I said before, we think that a legalized place to be for some people and an opportunity to have access to healthcare services are elements of a positive approach, but the overall approach, and especially the coercive and criminalizing aspects of it, are very concerning to us legally as well as morally. And so we are in no way advocating the St. Petersburg approach, or really any of the approaches in the case studies, as a perfect model, but each of them offers lessons that others can draw on in crafting their own solutions. There's another question about, is Pinellas Hope an example of what to avoid? It's marginalized and way outside of downtown on unincorporated land, ignoring citizen advocate proposals for a self-governing camp, and instead fast-tracked as a proposal by Catholic Charities to institute a top-down model that's quite expensive in considering people are living in tents. And I think those are all excellent points about some of the other negative aspects of the model. The locating it, even though they have brought some services there, the fact that it's located far from downtown and it's relatively difficult with public transit or other forms of transportation to get back downtown for many of the residents, and that it was instituted in a top-down process without the input of the people who would be being served in it. Those are, obvious human rights concerns, both from the access to services point. Part of the human right to housing is access to services and the location of the housing. So those are ways that it went down on that scale. And participation is an essential element, participation of the people being directly affected in the decisions that affect them. So those are elements that we wouldn't encourage either. Somebody's mentioning the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign is a great resource, and I definitely echo that. That's Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, PEHRC, PEHRC.org, I think. Why are criminalization laws being copied in other cities? Is there any evidence that criminalization cities are experiencing success, or are they just moving homeless people to other cities? I think criminalization approaches are growing in part because the visibility of homelessness is increasing with an ongoing economic crisis that hasn't been helping the so-called recovery isn't helping people at the lower end of the income spectrum. When homeless people are visible in communities, there's kind of a call for people to do something about it. And communities don't really evaluate their options well. They approach criminalization as a zero-cost solution, that we'll just arrest them or harass them and get them out of here, when in reality criminalization does actually cost the community in many cases more than providing housing or other services would. So criminalization is not the best approach, but communities either don't have information or ignore information that they do have that criminalization is not the best approach to be taking. And that's what this kind of demand to do something without a real evaluation of what that something should be is what's causing the growth of criminalization across the country. And in that regard, we do have an excellent report and advocates guide on criminalization more broadly on our website. It's called Criminalizing Crisis. And we will be doing an update to that report later this year as well. And there's a ton of great tools in there, as well as some of these cost studies and other examples of positive steps that communities have taken as alternatives to criminalization. And I would also mention the Searching Out Solutions report and the work that the Interagency Council is doing in that regard as resources to help communities avoid going down the road of criminalization. There's apparently a blog called Tent City Urbanism that's trying to create a cross-community network, so thanks for that tip. The folks in Eugene, Oregon, and the community, there's a tent city there called Whoville, who are part of kind of this ongoing activism that's been happening since the Occupy movement in Eugene really adopted the homeless community that was already existing in the first park, I believe, or maybe it was the second park where the occupiers occupied before they were evicted and moved around to different communities. The city of Eugene has been doing a lot of positive work, or the individuals in the city of Eugene have been doing a lot of positive work. The city has taken some very positive steps in creating a space for a legalized encampment, creating a legal car camping program, but they're also continuing to criminalize homelessness in some areas. And one encampment called Whoville is currently under threat of eviction, and without offering the people another place to go. Although I think the last update I heard was that they are looking at some alternative locations as well. Although I think many of the residents would prefer to stay where they are. So there's both very good news coming from Eugene and some cause for concern, but I think the engagement that groups have been making in Eugene with their local government and kind of the give and take is really inspirational. The steps that have been taken, even though there hasn't been what I would call a full victory for people yet, the steps that have been taken would have been unimaginable just a few years ago, and I think it's a real testament to both the willingness of the city government to work with people, but the constant advocacy of the local advocates, and the fact that they are talking about this issue as a human rights issue, that the local media is talking about it as a human rights issue, is a real great source of the success of the advocacy, even if it isn't complete, that the folks there have been having so far. There's another question about a nuisance abatement that's evicted people living north of LA in Antelope Valley, but they were far away from other individuals, but it's only going to increase the numbers of homeless people, and that their rights were violated. Again, I'd recommend sending me an email or giving us a call at our number on the screen, and if there's anything that can be done, we're certainly happy to look into it. And I know that the ACLU of Southern California, I think, is located in LA or somewhere in that neighborhood, and they've done some good work with homeless communities there as well. All right, I think that's those are all the questions that I see, and see we've gone a little bit over our time. So with that, if anybody has any further questions, feel free to be in touch. But otherwise, thank you for attending today's webinar. And as soon as we have more information to share with you about the report or the posting of this webinar, we'll get that information out to people. Thanks again, and keep up your good work, everyone. Bye.